Everybody. I'm Robbie Díaz, and let me see if I can go ahead and share my screen. Share. Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Right, so I'm Robbie Díaz, and some of you might know me from Twitter as Robbie Díaz at UCSF. And I am going to be talking today about how we can improve LGBTQ inclusion in academia and focus specifically on academic conferences, but a lot of the topics I'm going to bring up and points of discussion that I want to discuss with all of you are applicable to other realms of academia, not just conferences. But before we go into that, I just want to talk a little bit about who I am and why this is important to me. So I identify as queer. I'm cisgender, but I identify as queer male, and I'm also Latinx. My mom is Colombian, my dad's Puerto Rican. So I also live at this this interesting experience of being a person of color who's also part of the queer community. I'm a PhD candidate in biochemistry and molecular biology at the University of California, San Francisco. And I'm an advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion at my institution, as well as beyond. And I've worked with a lot of people, some of them photoed here from the UK, LA, and now New York. And also I'm an aspiring dog dad, so maybe one day I'll be able to own a dog if San Francisco apartments permit. But yeah, when let's see if I can advance. There we go. When I'm not doing research, I am participating in a lot of activism work and community building for queer community at UCSF. So I'm one of the 3 co-founders of the Graduate and Postdoc Queer Alliance. And over the past few years, we've done a few things to try and promote LGBTQ inclusion at our university, including hosted fundraisers for trans and non-binary rights, as well as this past year, we hosted a fundraiser for LGBTQ asylum seekers. And we also put on these panel discussions where we invite faculty and staff who have PhDs to speak. One of those events is called Trans Visibility in the Sciences, and the other one is Out in Science. And a lot of our leadership is also involved in hosting community events to try and bring together the queer community at UCSF. And we do that by hosting coffee hours, trivia, movie screenings, and museum visits and more. So before we dive into conference sites and the idea of how to make conferences more inclusive for LGBTQ individuals, I want to go over briefly just a timeline of inclusion in academia and what that has looked like over the past few hundred years. So in 859, the first higher educational institution, as we think of them, was established in Morocco. It was a madrasa that was an education center for Muslim education, and is still one of the longest lasting educational institutes in the world. And then about 200 years later, the first degree awarding institute, as we think of universities now, was founded in 1088 in Italy. And then the first reported instance of a woman being educated and receiving a degree from a university happened about another 200 years later in Italy. And then fast forward 600 years, where the United States allowed public universities to admit men and women to the same institution. And that was the first instance of co-ed universities taking place. And then about another 100 years later, Black people and other people of color were allowed to attend public universities as a direct result of the Civil Rights Act. And then a few years later, the first student gay rights group was founded at Columbia University in 1966, right a few years before the Stonewall riots took place. And then during the 70s, a host of different public institutions and private institutions began to allow women to apply to their universities. And the reason I bring this up is to show that while this is a very long timeline of about 1200, 1,200 years, it shows that women and people of color have been like slowly etching their way into academic inclusion, but unfortunately, that inclusion is still lacking when it comes to LGBTQ individuals for a handful of reasons, which I'll get into. But when we look at some factors that we typically think of as why people may not persist in STEM, those explanations don't really hold up when it comes to why are there less LGBTQ students in STEM. So one of the main predictors of retention in STEM is participation in research, and research by Bryce Hughes has actually shown that students who are sexual minorities participate in research at a higher rate than their heterosexual colleagues by about 8%, yet they're still less likely to continue on in a STEM major or STEM field compared to their straight colleagues. And in this paper, Hughes found that sex and sexual minority were negative predictors of retention, and that fits in line with the existing literature about race and gender expression negatively predicting one's retention in STEM, and points to a need to examine why is academia and STEM failing its LGBTQ students and how can we do better? Because if these students are as prepared, if not more prepared than others, and they're not being retained, it's not an issue of qualification, it's an issue of environment. And one of the main barriers to LGBTQ inclusion in STEM that is distinct from the gender and racial liberation movements is for a handful of LGBTQ people, they have the ability to pass or the choice to pass as being part of the majority group. And we see here in this figure that that has plenty of implications in one's professional development and their career. So on the left figure, you see that the majority of STEM faculty who are not out, about 80% of them, report feeling more comfortable in their department, whereas on the right-hand side, about 70% of faculty that were out reported feeling uncomfortable in their department. So while a small sample size, is a direct measurement of why people may choose to stay closeted or not disclose their sexual orientation or gender identity, regardless of how they present. And that, while is an act of self-preservation, can also undermine the advancement of queer inclusion in ways that was not necessarily applicable to the women's movement or to civil rights and racial liberation. So some of the major barriers to advancing LGBTQ inclusion include that, at least within the United States, there's no national survey tracking how many LGBTQ individuals there are in academia. So I was actually looking at this the other day, and there are studies here and there looking at individuals at institutions and at faculty levels, but there's no comprehensive data set that says there are this many straight faculty and this many queer faculty at any level in comparison to the data that we have on race and gender. And that data is extremely important for a handful of reasons, and a letter to the National Science Foundation was spearheaded by John Freeman, as well as Laura Durso and Romero, that was asking the National Science Foundation to pilot a survey that would track LGBTQ individuals. And one of the direct implications of not having this data is that some funding agencies don't consider queer identities to be underrepresented, and therefore queer individuals are not eligible for certain fellowships or for certain funding opportunities. And that can create a problem because we're not getting the support that we need. I see that there's a chat. Oh, okay. Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to send them in the chat. And then another huge barrier to LGBTQ inclusion is that leadership at various organizations, whether it's your academic society or your institution, your higher ed institution, is that they often don't engage with LGBTQ members. And you can see this in situations where people are asking, what is your gender on a registration form? And then they miss the mark entirely with asking if you're male, female, or LGBTQ/other, or prefer not to say, which leaves people with the option of answering dishonestly in their eyes or deciding to not be counted at all, which erases them from this data set. Then there are a little bit more well-intentioned efforts to include pronouns and trying to move towards the practice of sharing pronouns more often. And unfortunately, some institutions will call them preferred pronouns, and that can easily be avoided by consulting with queer individuals and realizing that it's not a preference as much as it is just an expression of who you are. When it comes to conferences, you sometimes see that these sessions that are focused on LGBTQ identity as well as other personal identities conflict directly with professional development sessions, if they even exist at all. So that's a huge gap for a lot of learners where they go to a conference and they have to choose between a professional setting, like a networking event, or if they want to go and interact with people from their community. Some other barriers include performative allyship. So whether individuals voice their support for the queer community but don't actively engage or promote change is, I think, a huge issue, largely because we need action and we need to push things forward. So this allyship is important and it's necessary, but we need to do more than just say words. And the topic that I'm going to focus on a little bit more is choice of conference site and how that plays out in preventing LGBTQ individuals from entering STEM fields or from feeling as comfortable as themselves within STEM. So not all conference sites are inclusive. In this map here, you see in red, these are states that it's a hate crime to discriminate against someone or based on their sexual orientation. In the dashed lines, hate crime laws also cover gender identity and gender expression. So all the states in gray do not have protections for either sexual orientation or gender identity and gender expression. And that poses a huge issue for conference attendees who may want to attend a professional conference, but have to decide between attending as their authentic selves and their professional development. And that creates a choice that no learner or academic should have to choose. In addition to causing people to choose between their professional development, their identity, it also compromises individuals' economic citizenship or their choice of where their money is spent. And the example I like to use to convey this idea is that all of us get to choose where we spend our money and who we support. And a great example of the queer community rallying together and saying, we're not spending our money here, was in 1977, where Florida gay rights activists decided to boycott Anita Bryant's orange juice company in Florida because she was leading the charge on getting a Miami-Dade County gay rights bill overturned. And the queer community said, we're not going to support you financially. And there are instances where people, not just in Florida, but nationally decided we're not going to support this. And it had huge economic implications for Anita Bryant and other companies that have experienced this as well. In addition to the choices that we make of where we spend our money, there's also choices of where we're allowed to spend our money. So in the United States, there are about 6 states that have implemented travel bans to other states with discriminatory legislation against LGBTQ individuals, meaning that you cannot use state funds from a certain state to travel to another one. So I'm in California, and I'm not allowed to use California state money to travel to any of the states in red. And as a learner, that places an extreme economic burden on myself as well as others who may not have access to federal funds or other money to attend conferences, and places a burden on the learner themselves. And in addition to an economic burden on learners that can be placed, the economic implications of where you host a conference are enormous. So conferences have decided in the past that they were going to rescind their contracts based on new legislation that's come up. An example is that the National Collegiate Athletic Association decided to pull their conference out of North Carolina after the HB2 bathroom ban was passed, and that was a very difficult decision, I think, for an organization like that, but it was an example of advocating for their members and their students and supporting inclusion. Another example is the American Counseling Association, which left Nashville as a conference site, and as a result, Nashville lost out on about $4 million of revenue, and that conference had about 3,000, would have had about 3,000 attendees. So it's really interesting and also important to understand that these conferences have huge economic clout, and we as members of those organizations should take that into account and see how we can leverage that for our benefit and the benefit of our queer community. So what can we do as individuals? It seems like an extremely daunting task to say, well, I'm going to change a whole state's government legislation, or I'm going to change the way that this whole organization runs. And you're right, it's probably not realistic to say I'm going to do that on your own. But there are still things that you can do as individuals that will empower you and still make a difference. So there are a few things I've outlined. There's the personal choice to not attend the conference and organize remote efforts. So in 2018, when I found out that the SACNAS conference was going to be hosted in San Antonio, and that was one of the states that had discriminatory legislation against LGBTQ individuals as well as undocumented individuals, I made the choice that I wasn't going to attend. But I worked with colleagues to promote awareness about the legislation in that state, and had colleagues distribute buttons at the conference that were promoting awareness in order to spark a conversation and hopefully motivate people to start discussing why this is important and why we need to do something. Other choices include attending the conference and trying to promote LGBTQ engagement, both within the conference and outside of the conference site with the local community. So sometimes the best way to be visible is to be present. And then if you choose to attend, making your presence known and making your need to be, or your need for safety and your need to be included known to other members as well as the community where the conference is hosted, I think is extremely important for improving the environment in future years. And the last personal choice that I'm going to outline is you can vote. You can vote in your organizational elections. You can choose board members who have the same values as you, who engage with you and listen to your opinions and what is important to you. And you can if you can, you should vote in your government elections, both local, state, and federal. These are extremely important, and the voting has a lot of impact, and it's not a one size fits all, like you vote and everything's fixed, but it's a stepping stone in the right direction. And we are also members of organizations, and that carries a lot of weight in that. While as a single person, we may not be able to accomplish a whole lot, we can work within organizational structures to try and do more and create a collective that works together. So some things that we can do as members of organizations include it's kind of obvious, but support LGBTQ attendees. And some ways we can do that are by offering pronoun stickers or offering ways for people to self-identify on their name badge and feel comfortable, like, and have that normalized. Having inclusive bathroom signage. So instead of having reinforcing gender binaries, you have signage that makes it clear that these bathrooms are inclusive to all genders. Offer LGBTQ programming, so have space for individuals to gather and to develop community, and also fund learner-led LGBTQ events. So there are plenty of instances where events will exist, but they're self-funded by learners, or they're not funded at all. And organizations have the infrastructure to provide funding for these events, and it really would demonstrate a commitment to increasing LGBTQ inclusion and retention by providing funds for those events to take place. Engage with discussions with your local government, and think about how can your organization apply economic pressure. So like I previously mentioned with the ACA and NCAA, those decisions to not host their conference at certain locations had huge economic implications on the cities, and that sort of leverage can be really important in promoting legal change. Also, allocating travel funds to members and states with hostile legislation. If your organization decides to not travel to certain states in order to try and protect the majority of its queer members, reallocating funds to help the members who live in the state that you're choosing not to attend year-round would be extremely beneficial, because you don't want to isolate them from the organization. And lastly, help members organize politically. So offering any guidance on how to engage in local politics and how to be an effective organizer and activist is extremely important, because as all of us know, science is political, and there's no way for us to do science and do it well if we're not our authentic selves. And to say that politics has no role in it is naive, frankly. So this is an extremely complex issue and a difficult one. I have my own personal stance on how I would like to see these changes move forward, but I know that other people may feel differently, and I welcome discussion from other people as to what their thoughts are and how we can improve inclusion in where we choose to host conferences, and how we can promote our organizations to be more inclusive. And yeah, I think there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution depending on your discipline or your identity, but I think having this discussion is important for moving progress forward. And with that, I'd just like to acknowledge some people who were extremely instrumental in the putting together this presentation, as well as some efforts I've done. Alf and Rob, who helped me put together this presentation and gave me feedback. Matt, for the opportunity to speak. Adair and Iris for helping co-found the Graduate and Postdoc Queer Alliance. Then Deanne, Melissa, Ramiro, and Steven, who were really instrumental in leading a petition against SACNAS National, asking them to consider choosing more inclusive conference sites, and then my thesis advisors, James and Sai, who have been extremely supportive of me, not only as a scientist, but also as an activist. And with that, I'll take any questions.